Hey YouTube, today we are building a SmartPWMv3 in the ABM-2-VM enclosure, the VM cutout. ABM-2, perfect size for dual 18650 setups. Got a top cover, hide the guts, make it look super clean. The SmartPWMv3 uses a microcontroller instead of a 555 timer. So there's all kinds of advanced features. Off the top of my head, I won't recite them, but check out the documentation for it. So stick around and we're going to build this thing. I'd like to take a few moments to talk about PWM. If you build super low resistance, PWM is probably not the best mod for you. A lot of people say you need to build as if it was an unregulated mod, and although PWM is regulated, the reason for that is the way PWM regulates. So it stands for pulse width modulation. Pulse being the max voltage of the batteries. So here we have two in series, so nominal 7.4 volts is going to be our max. And the width of the pulse is over time, and how long that time is depends on the frequency at which you're switching, but that doesn't really matter for now. Just that it's over time. Let's say, let's go about half here. Let's say 1 unit of time is this much, so we've got 2 here. If we're at a 50% duty cycle, so we're on about halfway, voltage drops to 0. We're off about halfway. We're on again about halfway through a unit of time. We're off again. So this would be a 50% duty cycle because we're on half the time and off half the time. And the way it regulates the voltage is you adjust the on versus off time. So if you turn down the duty cycle, then maybe you're on for a quarter of the time and off for 3/4 of the time. Now this happens thousands of times per second, but that's how it regulates. It's the on versus off time. And the reason you can't go too low is even though it regulates the on versus off time, the on pulses are always full voltage. So that's why if you build super low, PWM, probably not the best type of voltage regulation for you. PWM works great for things like LEDs because there's a ramp up time between as it turns on that it gets full brightness, and when it turns off as it dims to 0 brightness. Because this happens so fast and because there's a ramp up and ramp down time, you don't notice it. Also works great for things like electrical motors where there's a ramp up time between full speed and a ramp down time between fully stopped. PWM is great because the pulses happen so fast that it doesn't go fully off before it kicks in again. And same for vaping, where there's a ramp up time, the heat, and a ramp down time. It happens so fast, the output effect is the voltage regulation that you see. So that's PWM. So the first thing we'll do is epoxy the components that need to be epoxied. And while that's drying, we can work on other parts of the build. So the pot we're going to epoxy and the voltmeter, they both need a little bit of prep. For the pot, we're going to bridge the wiper, the middle lead and the 100 side together. And just hold it down so they cross. And I'll trim the excess. And the voltmeter, so the tool that does the machining is round. And because of that, you'll never see a perfectly sharp corner. So you might have a little trouble getting the voltmeter in. And if you do, I just gently file the edges on the voltmeter. Not a lot, just a few passes each. Also inspect the voltmeter. Sometimes there's glue around the edges. If that's the case, you can take a utility knife and scrape it off. This one looks fine. Another thing I try and do, I try and keep the voltmeter a little bit below the face of the enclosure. Reason being that black stuff on there can scratch off fairly easily. If it's perfectly flush and the mod gets laid down, it can scratch that. So by trying to stay like half a millimeter below face of the enclosure, you ensure that you'll never scratch that up. That looks good. Get our pot in there. I find lining up the arrow right to 50% makes it easier to eye it out so it's perfectly straight. Throw a piece of tape on there to make sure it doesn't budge while we're epoxying. Voltmeter's plenty snug, it won't move around. Okay, we'll mix up some epoxy. You want to clean up on the top here, because that top cover sits pretty low. Should be good. We'll let that dry. Okay, let's tackle the sled next. I've got, if you've seen other videos where I use a sled with a top cover, I had these hex standoffs that I would use, but I now got these little knurled inserts, which are a bit nicer. And the hole form's kind of too small, but just take your iron. Just the heat. It's going to melt the plastic around there and it'll slide right in. This being a 3D printed sled, we won't solder with the contacts onto the sled. I will, however, put them on for a sec just to get the length of our jumper wire. Use a small piece of 16 gauge. I'm just going to strip the whole thing because the thickness the insulation adds brings the bared part of the wire away from the contact. Let's tin these contacts. I said I wouldn't solder with the contacts on there, but changed my mind. It'll be the easiest way to get the jumper wire as close to the contacts as possible. There's a channel in the sled here, and if I wire that on first, I wouldn't be able to, or it'd be hard to get over that hump to have it sit in the channel nice. Now, the jumper wire's tinned, the contacts are tinned. I'm going to load up the iron. It'll be a 2-second thing. As that blob of molted, I said iron, as that blob of molted solder hits it, it'll remelt the solder that's on there, and so you'll see it'll be a really fast soldering. That looks good. Clean that off with a bit of alcohol. All right, the other side. Just mark where I want the set of the contact, want the wire coming out. Let's tin those. Go 16 gauge. For the batteries. I don't recommend doing this, but I'm going to solder with the contacts on there again. That's good. Right, I'm going to wire up the 510 negative only because the 510 positive goes straight to the battery sled. So I want to, we'll put the components in the enclosure after, and I'll measure the length before I cut that. Okay, let's get some of these components in here and start figuring out the length of our wires. I think I want the chip to sit about here. So the positive coming off the battery is going straight to the 510. Got that marked. The negative off the battery is going over to this hole here. I'm going to give myself a bit of slack so there's enough slack for it to go down into that hole. The negative off the 510 is going into the other hole. Same, little longer. Now the voltmeter, the red and yellow go to the chip. Again, bit of slack. Just cut these right now. Now the black, so there's three things that need to connect to common ground here. And there's one hole for it on the board. Well, actually there's two, but the voltmeter, one of the legs off the pot, and one side of the fire button. So I think I'm going to use the leg on the pot as a common location to solder all the grounds to, and then we'll run a small wire from that onto the board. So I'll measure this one to reach the pot. I should have had my fire button in there, but other side of the, so fire button again to the pot. Well, we'll need two. One side of the fire button goes to the board. Other side of the fire button is going to go to the pot. I can cut this one to length once the fire button's in there. And we'll need a small run from the pot to ground.
fire button in there.
First one I'll do is the ground onto the pot here. It goes on the bottom leg, the one that is not bridged. And I'll do the fire button to that same location on the pot. And I'll do a third wire again on that pot to go hit the ground on the board. Let's do our voltmeter. So second from top is yellow, next one is red. Do a short wire the other side of the pot. The jumpered side of the pot is the first hole in the corner here. And the ground is the one closest to the bigger hole on the bottom. Okay, let's wire the 510 positive. I'm going to bare this wire a little more than normal. We still need to bring power to the board, to the chip, and the documentation suggests to do that closest to the 510 as possible. So I'll bare a bit more of the red insulation here, which will give us some bare wire where I'm going to come tack one of the smaller 28 gauge wire to go feed power to the board. Should work. And now for those bigger wires. So, board's going to go down like this. We got battery on that side. In fact, let's do the 510 first. That should be it. Oh, and there's one more wire from the other side of the fire button onto the board. And of course our power to the board. Fire button goes 5th hole down. One with the square solder mask around it. power to the board. I'll wire it onto the board. Reacher 510. And power to the board is the square pad in the corner here. All right. Let's try and get everything in here. To secure the board down, I'm going to use that exterior grade double-sided tape I keep ranting and raving about. Try and get our 510 in there. And the last connection is power to the board, which will grab beside the 510 here. All right. Certainly a more advanced build than the DNA boards. Lots of little wires, get the right length, in which order to solder what, and so on. But it went fairly well. Before I get the top cover on there, let's throw some batteries in and see if this powers up. All right. I haven't put the magnets in or tighten down the 510 yet, but let's just make sure this works before we do that. Oh, some kind of boot up sequence going on. That looks promising. All right, 510. I mentioned it in the last video. I'll go into more detail here too. The way to use the 510 tool in case some of you don't know. Leave enough thread exposed on that side so we can screw into the 510, but also leave some space over on this side. So we're in. Use a pair of pliers to hold the inside nut. I shaved down a wrench just for this, so that holds that in place. Then use some bigger pliers. I use vice grips. These are kind of too big. Grab the top nut and we're going to tighten. Be careful. If you slip, you can scratch up the finish on the top of the enclosure. Then to remove it, need your Allen wrench, your hex wrench. Hold the big nut with your pliers, and try and unscrew. Okay, if ever unscrewing doesn't seem to release the tension, tighten, because as this screw plunges down, it unlocks or releases the tension on the bigger nut. So that is great. Let's get our cover on here. That's going to look great. The magnets. Now it's easy to mess up the polarity on the magnets. So my trick, or the way I do it, put all your magnets in a stack, mark the opposite ends, and we're going to feed from the unmarked end, and that goes down into the hole. In between each one, make sure you're on the right side of the stack. Same deal, we're feeding from the unmarked side of the stack. Okay, we'll let that dry. If you noticed, I bought a sheet of carbon fiber vinyl and I cut it out to cover the inside of the lid there. That'll look really nice. So let that dry and give this thing a bake. All right, let's get our batteries back in there. That looks really nice. It's pretty sweet. So to recap, we got the SmartPWMv3, one of the best smart PWM chips on the market. In the ABM-2-VM enclosure, the VM cutout. The ABM-2 designed for dual 18650s. White powder coat finish, black, everything else. The nice top cover makes the inside look super clean. So again, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.